It happened in a moment, blinding, radiant, terrifying. 3 men climbed a mountain with a teacher and came back with a secret too strange to explain. They saw his face change, not with sorrow or rage, but with light. Light that pulsed from his skin, from his clothes, from somewhere beyond the air. He glowed like lightning in human form. Then 2 long-dead prophets appeared beside him. A voice thundered from a cloud, and just as quickly as it began, it vanished. The church called it the Transfiguration. But what did they really see on that mountain, and why were they told to keep it quiet? You're not alone if this sounds less like a Bible story and more like something out of a cosmic sci-fi epic. Blazing light, time-warped figures, disembodied voices. The entire thing lasts only a few lines in most Gospels, and yet somehow it's one of the most mysterious moments in all of Christian scripture. So tonight you're going to lean in closer. You're going to lower the lights, let your thoughts slow down, and open your mind to the possibility that this wasn't just a religious vision or symbolic tale, but a rare glimpse behind the veil. A breach in reality. A single blinding second when Jesus did not merely perform a miracle, but pulled back the curtain on who he really was. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe, so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. You're standing at the base of a mountain in ancient Galilee, somewhere between the dusty lowlands and the wild craggy heights that fade into sky. The air is thinner here. The silence hangs heavier. You feel it in your chest even before anything happens, a hum, a warning, a knowing. That something is about to shift. That the world, for a flicker of a moment, might not obey its usual rules. According to the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, this is where Jesus took 3 of his disciples, Peter, James, and John, away from the others. No sermon, no crowd. Just a quiet ascent. The text doesn't say how long they climbed or whether they spoke along the way. It simply says they went up a high mountain by themselves. That's the kind of line you gloss over on a sleepy Sunday. Until you realize that what came next shattered everything they thought they knew. The change is described in brief, breathtaking simplicity. Jesus was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun. His clothes became dazzling white, whiter than any bleach could make them. Mark adds with a touch of dry humor that still works 2,000 years later. And suddenly standing beside him were 2 figures the disciples would have recognized instantly. Moses the lawgiver and Elijah the prophet who never died. There was no thunderous arrival, no special effects. They were just there, talking with Jesus as if they had known each other forever. The 3 disciples, sleep-deprived, awestruck, and terrified, watched from a few steps away, barely able to speak. Peter, ever the impulsive one, babbled about building 3 shelters to mark the moment. A kind of spiritual campsite. It's unclear whether he meant it literally, or was just trying to say anything at all to fill the silence. People do that when they're overwhelmed by the divine, or by awkward dinner guests. Then came the voice. A cloud enveloped them, a thick, luminous fog that swallowed sight and sound. And from within it, a voice said, "This is my Son, whom I love. Listen to him." That phrasing should sound familiar. It's nearly identical to the voice heard during Jesus' baptism. But here on the mountaintop, it carries a deeper weight. Because this isn't a public ritual. This is a private unveiling. A divine moment whispered to only 3 men. It's worth noting how different this story feels from the rest of the Gospels. It's not a parable. It's not a healing or an exorcism. It's not even a sermon. It's something else. Something that doesn't quite fit into the regular categories of ministry. It's closer to an encounter with raw presence. No one is helped, no one is fed, no one is converted. Instead, it's as if a layer of reality is momentarily peeled back to show something that shouldn't be seen. A hidden truth exposed, not explained. And yet, for all its dramatic power, the Transfiguration appears only briefly in Scripture. Matthew gives it 6 verses. Mark does the same. Luke takes a bit more time, but even then the event feels like a flash of lightning, dazzling, terrifying, gone too soon. There's also a fascinating absence here. The Gospel of John, written by the very disciple who supposedly witnessed the Transfiguration, doesn't mention it at all. Not even a passing reference. That's like someone watching fireworks explode in the sky and later forgetting to mention there was a show, or more likely choosing not to mention it. This silence has puzzled scholars for centuries. Did John believe the story didn't need repeating? Did he think it was too sacred to put into words? Or was it simply not part of the version of events he received or believed? Theories abound, but none are conclusive. And therein lies the first crack in the story's surface. One established fact that no one disputes is that mountaintops in ancient Jewish tradition were places of encounter. Moses met God on Mount Sinai. Elijah heard the still small voice on Mount Horeb. Mountains weren't just scenic overlooks, they were thresholds. Places where heaven touched earth, even if only for a breath. And so Jesus ascending a mountain isn't just about seeking solitude. It's about stepping into a liminal space, a thin place as the Celtic mystics might call it, where dimensions fold together like creased parchment. But there's a curious detail in Luke's version of the story that rarely gets discussed. He says the disciples were weighed down with sleep and that they only fully woke up as the vision unfolded. Were they dreaming? Were they caught in some kind of trance? Or was this narrative clue subtly hinting that what they witnessed straddled the line between dream and waking life? Some scholars have leaned into this ambiguity, suggesting that the Transfiguration might not have been a literal event, but a symbolic vision, a kind of prophetic dreamscape. Others argue passionately for its historicity, pointing out that the Gospels often present symbolic moments as just that parable's metaphors or visions. But the Transfiguration is framed differently. There's no indication it was a dream. No one wakes up at the end. No, and behold, it was a vision. Just stunned silence followed by a descent back into the ordinary world carrying a secret too wild to share. And perhaps that's the most telling part. Jesus tells them not to speak of it, not until he's risen from the dead, as if knowing that what they saw couldn't be understood in the present tense, as if it would only make sense in the shadow of resurrection. The story ends where it began, with silence. No miracles performed, no crowds gathered. Just a dazzling moment, a shrouded voice, and 3 stunned men who don't fully grasp what they've seen. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But for us, the investigation is only beginning. Because if we're going to unravel what really happened on that mountain, we'll need to look deeper. Into the missing pieces, the overlooked symbols, and the strange absences that surround this moment like fog around a peak. It's not just about what the Gospels say, it's about what they don't. You'd think an event, this dramatic light, pouring out of a man's face, ancient prophets appearing out of thin air, and the voice of God booming from a luminous cloud, would warrant at least a little elaboration, a few extra verses, maybe a poetic flourish or a moment of introspection from the witnesses. But instead we get what feels like a cosmic event described with all the detail of a weather report. It happened. It was bright. Then it was over. Moving on. That silence is deafening. Matthew, Mark, and Luke each recount the Transfiguration, but none of them lingers. The language is functional, not florid. You almost want to shake the authors and ask, "Wait, go back, what do you mean, his face shone like the sun? What did that look like? What did it feel like to be there?" But the Gospel writers move on without answering. They don't offer insight into the emotional aftermath. No reflective dialogue between the disciples, no commentary from Jesus, just a few verses, and then it's back to the journey toward Jerusalem. This brevity is especially curious when you remember how often the Gospels devote entire chapters to minor miracles or parables involving lost coins and mustard seeds. Yet here, at what appears to be the most unfiltered moment of divine revelation in Jesus' earthly life, we get a total of 18 verses across 3 Gospels. It's like watching the trailer for a film that never got released. The starkness of the text raises a troubling possibility. Did they leave things out on purpose? Some early theologians believed the Gospel authors withheld parts of the Transfiguration because they feared its implications. Not just its supernatural weirdness, but its theological weight. If Jesus could shimmer with divine glory before his death and resurrection, what did that mean for the idea of progressive revelation? Wasn't that kind of radiance supposed to come after the resurrection, not before? Could this be a glimpse of something that didn't fit the narrative arc, like a flash forward in a story that's not supposed to have one? There's also the question of authorship. Modern biblical scholars have noted that Mark's Gospel, believed by many to be the earliest written, tends to portray the disciples as baffled and bumbling. In his account, Peter's suggestion to build tents for Jesus, Moses, and Elijah is clearly mocked. He didn't know what he was saying. It's comic relief amid cosmic wonder. But Matthew, writing later and with a more polished theological lens, tones down Peter's blunder and shifts the tone toward awe. Luke, for his part, adds a few curious details that neither of the others includes, like the fact that Jesus was praying when the change occurred, and that Moses and Elijah were discussing his departure, a phrase loaded with layers of meaning in Greek. And then there's John. John, who was supposedly one of the 3 on the mountain, doesn't mention the Transfiguration at all. No shining face, no glowing robes, no Moses, no Elijah, nothing. That absence has spawned libraries of speculation. Some argue that John's entire gospel is one long meditation on the glory of Christ, rendering the Transfiguration redundant. Others wonder if John, writing last, assumed his readers already knew the story and chose instead to explore different dimensions of Jesus' identity. Still others suggest something more tantalizing, that John was forbidden to write about it, or that the experience was so otherworldly, so destabilizing, that words failed him. One theory, whispered among the more mystical commentaries, suggests that John didn't omit the Transfiguration. He encoded it. In the prologue to his Gospel, he writes, "We have seen his glory, the glory as of the only begotten of the Father." Could that be a veiled reference to the mountaintop? Or is it simply poetic theology? The lack of clarity opens the door to other less comfortable possibilities. Maybe the early church edited the accounts. Maybe what the disciples saw was too strange to include in full. Maybe the voice from the cloud said more than just one line, and that part got lost or deliberately erased. After all, early Christian communities were wrestling with heresies, controversies, and political pressure. Including a story that made Jesus look like a radiant deity before the resurrection might have been a theological grenade. An obscure but striking detail comes from early church historian Origen, who claimed that the Transfiguration represented not just Jesus' change, but the disciples' sudden ability to perceive his true form. In other words, it wasn't Jesus who changed, it was their vision that sharpened. The light was always there. The glory was always blazing. They just couldn't see it, until that moment. If true, it reframes everything. It turns the Transfiguration from a divine performance into a psychological and spiritual rupture in human perception. This idea has intrigued modern theologians and psychologists alike. Was the mountain a trigger point for altered consciousness? Were the disciples caught in some kind of ecstatic trance state? Their confusion afterward, falling to the ground, babbling nonsense, being told to keep silent, certainly fits the symptoms of sensory overload. You don't see God in a blaze of glory and go back to eating figs like nothing happened. And then there's the curious command to tell no one. Jesus, who often urged others to spread the news of healings and miracles, tells the three to stay quiet about this. Why was it? Because no one would believe them, because they barely understood it themselves, or because in some mysterious way the story wasn't safe? Silence in ancient traditions wasn't always about secrecy. Sometimes it was about power, holding back knowledge to preserve its potency. In mystical schools, not all teachings were shared aloud. Some truths were whispered in caves passed between trembling hands, reserved for those deemed ready. Was the Transfiguration one of these? The mystery deepens when you realize how little the Church Fathers elaborated on the event. Augustine touches on it briefly. Chrysostom tries to moralize it, but few dive into its strangeness. It's as if the Transfiguration sat there in the canon like a glowing anomaly, acknowledged, revered, and quietly left alone. And yet its very silence pulls you closer, like a half-erased painting or a page missing from an ancient book. What details were never written down? What happened in the gaps between the gospel lines we may never know. But if you listen closely to the quiet, something flickers. A light too bright for ink, too strange for scrolls, still echoing across the centuries waiting. You're sitting with the text now. 3 Gospels, 3 accounts, one glowing man atop a mountain. You reread the lines, trying to hold on to them, but the more you examine them, the more they begin to slip. Were the disciples witnessing something real, or were they swept into a shared vision, a dream, a trance? It's the sort of question that makes you feel like you've lost gravity, not because it's unanswerable, but because the boundaries of real start to wobble. Throughout Christian history, scholars and mystics have debated whether the Transfiguration was a literal event that unfolded in space and time, or a symbolic revelation granted to just a few. Those who lean toward the literal tend to point out the simplicity of the gospel narratives. There's no vision language. They say no, he saw as if, or he dreamed. The disciples climb the mountain. They see, they hear, they descend, and they're terrified. If it were a symbolic vision, wouldn't the writers have framed it as such? But others are not so convinced. And this is where things begin to shimmer. Luke's version includes a peculiar phrase: the disciples were weighed down with sleep. They only fully awoke as the Transfiguration occurred. This to some suggests an altered state of consciousness. Perhaps they were dreaming. Perhaps they were in that hypnagogic state between waking and sleeping, where visions flicker like candlelight. The ancient world took such states seriously. Dreams weren't just mental static. They were messages, portals, divine interruptions. Now imagine it from their perspective. You're climbing a mountain in the fading light, exhausted, your teacher unusually quiet. You sit down to rest your eyes, heavy and then light. Not just light, but light that burns through your eyelids. You open your eyes and reality has bent. Jesus is glowing. 2 men you've never met, but somehow know, are standing beside him. And a voice speaks, not to all mankind, not to a gathered crowd, but to you. Just you. If it was a dream, it was vivid enough to etch itself into the bones of 3 men so deeply that they never forgot it. If it was a vision, it was unlike any other recorded in the New Testament. And if it was a hallucination, Well-shared hallucinations are rare, especially among fishermen who didn't have access to psychedelic fungi. But here's the twist in the ancient world. The distinction between vision and reality wasn't as rigid as ours. Spiritual visions were real. Mystical experiences weren't seen as internal delusions, but as genuine glimpses into another realm just as real and perhaps more so than the material world. This is where the Gospel of Thomas, though not part of the canonical Bible, throws a torch into the shadows. In it, Jesus says, "If you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you." The language is cryptic, but it points toward an inner revelation. One where the divine is seen not just with eyes, but with being. A vision, then, could be an unveiling of what always was, rather than a performance of something new. And that brings us to one of the most bizarre and beautiful theological interpretations, that the Transfiguration wasn't a moment when Jesus changed, but when the disciples' perception shifted. Jesus didn't become radiant. He was radiant. He had always been. But in that moment on that mountain, their eyes were briefly allowed to see it. As if someone turned off the filter of normality and let the truth blaze through. This view appears in the writings of early mystics, like Gregory of Nyssa, who suggested that the Transfiguration reveals not a new aspect of Christ, but the unveiling of his eternal nature. A divine essence that could no longer be cloaked by the limits of human flesh. Still others point to a more symbolic reading. Moses and Elijah represent the law and the prophets. Jesus stands between them, fulfilling, surpassing, glowing with the light of a new covenant. The mountain is not a physical geography, but a metaphorical ascent. The cloud is not literal weather, but the ancient symbol of divine mystery. And the voice a confirmation that what they now see, the radiant one in the center, is not merely a teacher. He is the beloved. And yet one detail keeps the vision grounded. The reaction of the disciples. They're terrified, disoriented. They fall on their faces. Peter starts nervously suggesting real-world solutions. Let's build some tents. He's not experiencing symbolic clarity. He's panicking like someone who's just seen something that ruptured the rules of time and matter. And then there's the descent. After the moment fades, Jesus touches them. Physically. Tells them to rise. And they walk back down the mountain together. That touch matters. It drags the story back into the realm of the tangible. This wasn't a dream from which they awoke alone in a cave. They came down with him. The light gone, the prophets vanished, but the air still charged with something unnameable. One obscure detail in Eastern Orthodox liturgy keeps this thread alive. On the Feast of the Transfiguration, the faithful bless grapes, symbolizing the harvest, the first fruits, the transformation of the ordinary into the divine. This small ritual suggests something often forgotten, that the Transfiguration wasn't just about light and glory. It was about transformation. Not only of Jesus' appearance, but of human vision, of what it means to see, of what it means to know. And that opens the final question still whispered across centuries. If the Transfiguration was a vision, then whose was it? Was it the disciples? Was it Jesus's? Was it God's vision of humanity finally catching up to reality? Or was it perhaps the world itself momentarily dreaming of heaven? As we continue, this ambiguity will follow us like fog on a mountainside, not to confuse, but to invite. Because whatever happened up there, vision or not, it changed everything. You squint at a map of ancient Palestine, finger-tracing ridgelines and high points looking for clues. The Gospels don't name the mountain curiously. They just call it a high mountain. No coordinates, no inscriptions carved in stone to commemorate the spot. Just elevation and enigma. Yet for centuries, tradition has pointed to one particular summit, Mount Tabor. Rising about 1,800 feet above the Jezreel Valley, Mount Tabor stands alone like a sentinel. It's not part of a range, but a dome-shaped prominence visible from miles in every direction. At sunrise, it glows. At dusk, it disappears into a silhouette against the purpling sky. It's the kind of place ancient people would have watched carefully, associating it with omens, gods, and cosmic events. Early Christian pilgrims certainly thought so. By the 4th century, Mount Tabor had become the accepted site of the Transfiguration. Churches were built there. Monks moved in. Pilgrims climbed its slopes with reverence and aching knees. By the time of Origen and Jerome, both heavyweights in early Christian theology, Tabor was locked in as the holy mountain. Even today, a church crowns its summit, a layered fortress of stone and iconography, sitting atop centuries of sacred rumor. But there's a problem. A historical speed bump. In Jesus' time, Mount Tabor may not have been the isolated, peaceful mountaintop it is today. Archaeological evidence suggests there was a fortified settlement at the summit during the 1st century. That would have made it an odd choice for a private retreat. It's hard to have a mystical moment when Roman patrols might be walking by, offering unsolicited opinions on glowing robes. Some scholars argue instead for Mount Hermon, far to the north, taller, snow-capped, and near Caesarea Philippi, the site of Peter's famous confession just before the Transfiguration in the Gospel timeline. It's more remote, more dramatic, and significantly higher, towering over the landscape at over 9,000 feet. It feels more appropriate somehow, more fitting for a moment when heaven brushes earth. So if the geography is uncertain, why the insistence on Tabor? Because places accumulate meaning, sometimes slowly, like moss growing on stone. Other times, all at once, like lightning striking a hill and forever marking it sacred. Tabor had a history long before the Gospels were written. In the Hebrew Bible, it's associated with victory and revelation. The prophet Deborah summoned Barak there before leading Israel to triumph over the Canaanites. Psalm 89 even pairs Tabor with Mount Hermon in praising God's creation. Both mountains had mythic weight. Both were liminal, layered with echoes. And then there's the shape. Mount Tabor's round, lone silhouette makes it visible from great distances, a beacon in the landscape. It's not hard to imagine Jesus selecting it precisely because it stood apart, not the tallest, but the most recognizable. A mountain that seemed made to be noticed. Perhaps the disciples trudging up its slope didn't know what waited at the summit. But the mountain itself already whispered that something strange was coming. One obscure detail buried in the writings of medieval monks suggests that Tabor had long been a place of pre-Christian worship. Pagan rituals may have once been performed there, sacrifices offered to gods long forgotten. If true, the choice of Tabor would have been more than symbolic. It would have been a reclamation. A declaration that divine presence now shone from a different light. This wouldn't be the first time Jesus chose to stand where old powers once reigned. He preached in synagogues and by pagan cities. He healed in places considered ritually unclean. He walked through Samaria. Why not ascend a mountain that once served another god and illuminate it with his own glory? And if you return to the image, Jesus radiant, flanked by Moses and Elijah atop a mountain surrounded by mist, you begin to see why geography matters. This isn't just about elevation. It's about setting. The mountain becomes a stage, a cosmic theater, a place outside of time where the law, the prophets, and the divine collide. But still the question lingers, was it Tabor or Hermon or some unnamed hill known only to the disciples and their memories? Perhaps that's part of the point. The Gospel writers leave it vague. They name cities, villages, lakes, but not this mountain, as if to protect it, or to universalize it. Maybe the mountain wasn't meant to be found. Maybe it was never about the rocks beneath their feet, but the threshold they crossed. Maybe every mountain is in some way Tabor. Every quiet place where the divine makes itself known. Every moment when your eyes blink and reality glows. Even today, those who climb Mount Tabor speak of a strange stillness at the top. A hush, as if the air remembers, as if something once happened here that refuses to be forgotten. So whether the mountain was Tabor Hermon or something else entirely, its mystery persists. Its summit remains veiled in the same kind of cloud that once overshadowed 3 frightened disciples. And from within that cloud, a voice still echoes, not with coordinates or footnotes, but with a declaration that continues to reshape the world. This is my son. Listen to him. You're standing there blinking against the brightness, heart racing from the light you can't explain. Jesus is glowing. Not metaphorically, not spiritually. He is literally glowing. His face beams like the sun, his clothes shimmer like lightning, and 2 impossible figures, Moses and Elijah, are somehow real and alive and talking to him like old friends at a reunion. You're Peter, and you have absolutely no idea what to do with your hands, so you blurt something out. Rabbi, it's good for us to be here. Let us put up 3 shelters, 1 for you, 1 for Moses, and 1 for Elijah. This moment, preserved in all 3 synoptic Gospels, is often read as comedy. A nervous disciple fumbling for a way to make sense of the cosmic. It has the energy of someone walking into a surprise party and offering to wash the dishes. And Mark doesn't spare him. He did not know what to say, the Gospel reads, for they were terrified. But maybe Peter's words weren't just fear-fueled nonsense. Maybe in that wild suggestion, he was tapping into something ancient and instinctive. The idea of building tabernacles, temporary dwellings, wasn't random. It echoed Jewish tradition. During the Feast of Tabernacles, or Sukkot, the faithful erected shelters to remember the wilderness wanderings, the divine presence that led Israel through the desert. Peter's offer may have been less about pitching a tent and more about responding to the sacred with the only gesture he could muster: worship. Still, terror was undeniably there. That's the word used. Not awe, not reverence. Terror. The kind that short-circuits logic and leaves you scrambling for words. It's a fascinating emotional collision, fear and devotion tangled into one. You love the light, but it's too bright to look at. You want to be near it, but your knees buckle. You reach for ritual because the moment is too vast to face raw. Historians have long pointed out that in divine encounters across Scripture, fear is the default reaction. When Moses sees the burning bush, he hides his face. When Isaiah glimpses God's throne room, he cries out, "Woe is me." And when angels appear, their first words are almost always, "Do not be afraid." Heaven, it seems, is consistently terrifying. And yet Peter doesn't run. He doesn't hide behind a rock. He doesn't fall unconscious like someone in a trance. He steps forward. He speaks. And though his words are awkward and arguably unnecessary, they come from a place of deep reverence. Some theologians suggest that Peter wasn't merely panicked, he was trying to hold on to the moment, to prolong it, to capture what he instinctively knew was holy. If you've ever been in a place so beautiful you wanted to stop time, or with someone whose presence made you forget the clock entirely, you understand this. Peter wanted to keep them there. Not just Jesus, but Moses and Elijah too. A perfect trinity of law, prophet, and Messiah, frozen in radiance. There's also something revealing in what Peter doesn't say. He doesn't ask questions. He doesn't demand explanations. He doesn't gasp. How is this happening, or what are they talking about? Instead, he defaults to a sacred reflex: build something. Mark the space. Honor the presence. But there's a shadow under his impulse. Because in his eagerness to make meaning, Peter may have been trying to control the uncontrollable, to domesticate the divine, to package the experience into something manageable. A booth, a structure, something you can point to and say, this is where it happened. This is how we remember it. The divine response is telling. While Peter is still speaking, still offering his tent-building plan, the cloud descends. Thick and bright and overwhelming, and from the cloud a voice interrupts him. This is my Son, the Beloved. Listen to him. Not build for him. Not worship him here. Just listen. It's a gentle rebuke, maybe. A divine redirection. Don't try to freeze the moment. Don't cling to the brightness. Just hear him. Follow him. Understand that what you're seeing isn't a place to stay, but a path to walk. And then the moment ends. Just like that. The light fades. The figures disappear. The mountain is quiet again. Only Jesus remains looking as he always did. No glow, no thunder, just the familiar face of a teacher friend and mystery. One obscure commentary from a medieval mystic suggests that Peter's reaction, his wild offer of building shelters, wasn't about honoring the holy trio at all. It was a desperate attempt to stay on the mountain, to avoid going back down, because he knew what waited at the bottom. Crowds, conflict, and eventually a cross. The mountain was peace, the valley was death, and yet they descended. This moment, as awkward as it reads on the page, reveals something profoundly human. We want to worship the glory. We want to stay in the light. But the journey always continues. Glory fades, the voice recedes, and we walk forward. Still, Peter's strange, stumbling reaction matters. It's preserved in all three Gospels not as a joke, but as a testament to the confusion of encountering the truly divine. Because when light pours out of a man's body and ancient prophets appear in the mist, you don't get it right. You don't say the perfect thing. You say what you can. You reach for the nearest tradition, the nearest shape of reverence. And if your voice trembles a little, if your suggestion is half-baked and wrapped in fear, maybe that's part of the holiness too. You know who they are the moment you see them. You've never met them, of course. They lived over 1,000 years ago. But somehow there's no confusion. One carries the gravity of law carved into stone. The other, the wildfire of a prophet who never died. Moses and Elijah. Standing beside Jesus on a mountain, talking with him not as ghosts or apparitions, but as real presences. Recognizable, conversational, like they'd just stepped out of time to make an appointment, and not just with Jesus but with history itself. The Gospels offer no dialogue. They don't record a single word of what the three figures discussed. Luke, in a small mercy to our curiosity, mentions that Moses and Elijah spoke with Jesus about his departure, which he was about to bring to fulfillment at Jerusalem. But that single line is all we get. Departure, a word loaded with implication. In Greek, the word is exodos, yes, like that Exodus. Moses' word. A journey out, a path through suffering wilderness, and eventually glory. So why these two? Why not Abraham, the patriarch of the covenant, or David, the royal ancestor? Or Isaiah, who so famously prophesied the suffering servant? The answer may lie not in who they were individually, but in what they represented together. Moses was the lawgiver, the one who climbed Sinai, fasted for 40 days, received the tablets of stone and radiated light after speaking with God. Elijah was the prophet who called down fire from heaven, confronted kings, and then disappeared in a whirlwind without ever tasting death. Together they embody the law and the prophets. The entire Hebrew scriptural tradition distilled into two figures, standing now with Jesus not as rivals or relics, but in conversation, as if to say, we've brought you this far. The rest is yours. But there's something more, a deeper symmetry. Moses and Elijah both had mountaintop encounters with God. Moses on Sinai, Elijah on Horeb. Both knew the terror of divine nearness. Both were shielded by clouds, spoken to by unseeable voices, and overwhelmed by presence. In this moment, on the Mount of Transfiguration, it's almost as if those old mountaintop moments are being folded into a new one. A gathering of those who had once glimpsed glory now witnessing it, revealed fully in the face of Jesus. There's an obscure rabbinic tradition that says Elijah would one day return before the coming of the Messiah. He would be a forerunner preparing the way. And in some parts of Jewish tradition, Moses too was expected to reappear at the end of days to finish what he began. Here on this mountaintop, that expectation seems to crystallize not in warning, but in confirmation. They are not there to predict the Messiah. They are there to recognize him. And yet their presence introduces a theological wrinkle that has never been fully ironed out. Were they resurrected, temporarily reanimated? Were these visions symbols, holograms powered by God's own electricity? Some scholars have argued that Moses' appearance is problematic because according to Deuteronomy, no one knew where he was buried. He died outside the Promised Land. Yet here he is not only present, but on holy ground, fulfilled at last. Elijah, on the other hand, never died. He was taken up, which makes his reappearance a little more logistically feasible if you can suspend your disbelief at whirlwinds and flaming chariots. There's even a curious early Christian interpretation that Moses and Elijah represent the dead and the living. Moses, who died, stands for those who sleep in the earth. Elijah, who never died, stands for those still alive. Together, they represent the totality of humanity bearing witness to Christ's glory. But not everyone agreed. A controversial early theory once suggested that these two figures weren't really Moses and Elijah, but symbolic projections, that they were constructs, not people, theological stand-ins conjured into form to make a point. That idea didn't last long, mostly because it stripped the moment of its mystery. It turned radiance into parable, and no one goes silent from parable. You go silent from presence. There's something haunting, too, in how easily they disappear. No drawn-out farewell, no ascension. One moment they're speaking, the next they're gone. The light fades, and Jesus is alone again. You're left with a memory that burns like a brand. Were they ever there at all, and yet you know they were? Some mystics believed that this moment wasn't about them appearing, but always being there. Hidden presences alongside the Christ, veiled from mortal eyes, revealed only in moments of divine overlap. Their presence wasn't summoned. It was unveiled. And so the mystery remains. Moses, who never stepped into the Promised Land, now stands within it on a mountain, gazing not at stone tablets, but at a man whose face glows brighter than Sinai ever did. Elijah, the untamed prophet of fire, stands beside one whose voice will thunder from the cross. Together they bear silent witness to a moment that refuses to be explained. And if the mountain shakes a little as they leave, well, that's the sort of thing mountains do when touched by eternity. The light fades just slightly, and in its place comes something even more unsettling. A cloud. Not the wispy, cotton soft kind that drifts gently across blue skies. This one is thick, heavy, luminous in a way that defies physics. It descends slowly, silently, until it swallows everything: Jesus, Moses, Elijah, and the trembling disciples into a brilliant, sacred fog, and then the voice. Not from Jesus, not from the prophets, but from within the cloud itself. No figure attached, no visible mouth to utter the words. Just sound vast and intimate at once. This is my Son, the Beloved. Listen to him. The voice doesn't elaborate. No footnotes, no sermon. Just those few words enough to shake the disciples to their knees. Matthew says they fall face down in terror. Luke hints they're so overcome they barely know what's happening. Mark, as usual, keeps it brief, almost like he's afraid to linger. This isn't the first time such a voice has appeared. At Jesus' baptism, the skies open, and a similar phrase is spoken. You are my beloved Son. With you I am well pleased. But here on the mountain, the message is subtly different. It's not addressed to Jesus. It's directed at the disciples. A shift in audience. A cosmic command, listen to him. The implication is jarring. It suggests that even now, after following Jesus, after watching him heal, teach, rebuke demons, they still haven't fully heard him. Not really. And that what's coming next will require a level of attention, obedience, and faith far beyond anything they've yet mustered. Historically, clouds in Scripture are not just meteorological phenomena. They're divine markers. When Moses ascended Sinai, it was a cloud that shrouded the mountain for 6 days before God spoke. When the tabernacle was completed in the desert, a cloud descended to cover it, signaling God's dwelling among his people. In Ezekiel, a luminous cloud fills the temple with terrifying brilliance. And in Acts, when Jesus ascends, it is a cloud that hides him from view. The cloud then is not concealment, it's presence. It's how God arrives. And the voice within it, that's not metaphor either. In ancient Jewish thought, the bat coal, literally daughter of a voice, was the term used for divine speech, heard without a visible source. It was rare, mysterious, and always carried weight. When the bat coal spoke, something permanent shifted. History bent slightly, people trembled, the world realigned. Some scholars believe this moment was inserted by early Christian writers to tie Jesus more closely to the divine, another theological signpost confirming his identity. But that doesn't quite hold up, because the voice is not grandstanding. It's not saying worship him. It's not demanding titles or confessions. It's simply saying, listen. As if the real mystery is not the radiance, not the glow or the company of Moses and Elijah, but the words Jesus speaks, the message they carry. And if that's true, then what exactly were the disciples not hearing? An obscure strand of mystical theology mostly ignored by mainstream commentators suggests that the voice from the cloud represents the Logos itself, the eternal Word speaking again into time, just as it had at creation. Let there be light was the first spoken act in Genesis. Now here on a mountain, wrapped in that same divine light, another command. Listen. But listen to what, by this point in the gospel timeline, Jesus has already begun to say troubling things. He's predicted his death. He's hinted at betrayal. He's warned his followers that suffering awaits. And perhaps the disciples, like many of us, had tuned that part out, clung instead to the miracles, the crowds, the glory. Maybe they needed a literal thunderclap to jolt them back into the unfolding reality. Not a kingdom of power, but a path of sacrifice. Not thrones, but crosses. There's also something eerie in the timing. The cloud descends right as Peter is trying to build something, 3 dwellings for Jesus, Moses, and Elijah. He's speaking, babbling, maybe caught between awe and confusion. And it's in that moment that the voice cuts in. Not to validate the tense, not to echo Peter's reverence, but to redirect him. Stop talking, listen. And just like that, the cloud vanishes. The Gospels offer no details about how it lifts. No gust of wind, no trumpet blast. It's just gone. And when the disciples open their eyes, they see no one but Jesus, alone. The light has dimmed. The prophets have disappeared. The mountain is quiet. This sudden shift has led some commentators to suggest the cloud was more than divine special effects. It was a veil, a barrier between realms briefly pulled back. And the voice, a crack in the firmament. A reminder that the world is layered, that something ancient and unspeakable pulses just beneath the visible. There's a lesser-known interpretation, buried in the writings of a Syriac mystic named Jacob of Sarug. He suggested that the voice from the cloud was the echo of Sinai now spoken not to a nation, but to 3 men who stood for the future church. Just as Israel once heard God speak from smoke and fire, now the apostles hear from brightness and mist. The same voice, a new revelation. Still, the question remains, did anyone else hear it? Were there distant shepherds unaware who stopped mid-step and looked to the hills? Did birds hush? Did time itself hesitate? We'll never know. But for the 3 who heard it, the moment was unforgettable. It followed them down the mountain, echoed in their bones, haunted their dreams. A voice not of comfort, not even of explanation. Just a sentence, a spotlight. Listen to him. And perhaps in the end, that was the true miracle, not the light or the cloud or even the ancient prophets, but that the voice chose to speak again. Briefly, clearly, without thunder or plague, just one more invitation to tune your soul to something higher. You've heard this melody before. Not in the same key, not with the same words, but the tune is unmistakable. A mountain, a cloud, a voice, a man standing alone in the blaze of divine light. The Transfiguration, as it turns out, is not a solo act. It's a reprise, a careful echo of stories already etched into Israel's collective memory. Start with Moses. He climbs Mount Sinai, disappearing into smoke and thunder for 40 days. When he comes down, his face glows. Not a poetic metaphor, his skin literally radiates light. So much so that the Israelites beg him to cover it with a veil. The glory is too much, too close. And he carries in his hands the law written by God himself. Sinai, in this sense, becomes not just a location, but a blueprint. A place where divine presence descends and humanity receives more than it can bear. Then there's Elijah. After calling down fire from heaven and fleeing a murderous queen, he runs to Mount Horeb, another name for Sinai. There he hides in a cave, trembling, exhausted. And God appears, but not in the earthquake, not in the wind, not even in the fire, in a whisper, a still small voice. Elijah, like Moses, covers his face. Another mountaintop moment, another brush with the ineffable. Now jump forward centuries, and you're on another mountain. This time it's not God appearing to one man, but the Son of God appearing in glory with both of them. Moses and Elijah, Sinai and Horeb now joined with Jesus, forming a kind of divine trifecta. The law, the prophets, and the fulfillment of both converging in light. This is more than coincidence. It's choreography. Ancient Jewish tradition held that certain mountains were not just high places, but thin places. Places where heaven drew close, where the ordinary peeled back just enough to let the eternal bleed through. Sinai was one, Horeb was another. And now this unnamed mountain in the Gospels joins their ranks. A new summit layered atop the old ones, not replacing them, but fulfilling them. The parallels are startling. Moses fasts before ascending Sinai. Jesus fasts in the wilderness before his public ministry. Moses climbs alone and is enveloped by cloud. Jesus brings 3 witnesses, but ends up in a cloud anyway. Moses descends to find chaos and idolatry. Jesus descends to a world that still won't understand him. But there's a difference. On Sinai, the glory of God reflects onto Moses. He becomes radiant, yes, but only as a mirror. On the Mount of Transfiguration, Jesus generates the light. It doesn't bounce off him. It comes from him. The source, not the recipient. The fire, not the reflection. That distinction isn't small. It's seismic. It turns the entire mountaintop motif on its head. Where Moses was a servant invited into glory, Jesus is the glory. And yet in a strange, almost tender twist, he shares the space. He stands beside the 2 who once trembled before the cloud and thunder, not as their master, not even as their fulfillment, but as one who knows what it means to climb, to fast, to face the voice. Some mystics have suggested that the mountain of the Transfiguration isn't just metaphorically linked to Sinai and Horeb, it is Sinai and Horeb. That in a realm beyond geography, these mountains are one and the same. A sacred recurrence, a spiritual axis, the place where the human and divine always meet. One obscure Gnostic text, long since banished to the apocryphal attic of church history, claims that Moses and Elijah did not appear on the mountain because they had never left it. That they were always there, hidden behind the veil of time, waiting for the one moment when all threads would be drawn together. The law, the prophet, and the Messiah, 3 arcs, 1 fire. Even the voice fits this pattern. On Sinai it was thunderous. On Horeb it was a whisper. On this mountain it speaks from a cloud, both terrifying and tender. Not angry, not demanding, just affirming, "This is my son." As if to say, all the laws you received, all the whispers you heard, they were pointing here. This continuity has fascinated scholars who trace the evolution of divine encounter in the Bible. From distant flames to quiet breath, from tablets to teachings, from terror to light. Each mountain moves closer, becomes more human, more luminous, until finally divinity stands not in smoke or whisper, but in a man whose eyes blaze with the fire of Sinai and whose words carry the hush of Horeb. And here's the twist that lingers like incense none of the disciples say. This reminds me of Moses. None of them quote Elijah. They don't need to. The moment speaks for itself. Their bodies understand, even if their minds don't. The mountain is humming with echoes layered with memory, vibrating with a history that's being fulfilled even as it unfolds. You wonder then what Jesus felt in that moment. Did he remember the stories, the scrolls he read as a boy, the teachings he heard in the synagogue? Did he sense the weight of standing not just on sacred ground, but as sacred ground? Did he feel the pull of Sinai in his bones? One can only guess. But the link is there, undeniable, hidden in plain sight. So the next time someone tells you that the Bible is a collection of random stories stitched together, you can smile quietly. Because somewhere high above the valley where clouds gather and voices whisper, 3 mountains stand atop one another. And on that summit, light pours forth not just once, but every time someone dares to climb. There's a moment when language fails, when whatever vocabulary you've brought with you, Greek, Aramaic, English, just melts. And so the gospel writers, faced with describing the indescribable, fall back on comparison. His clothes became dazzling white, says Mark, whiter than anyone in the world could bleach them. Matthew goes cosmic. His face shone like the sun, and his garments became white as light. Luke, ever the physician, simply says they became bright as a flash of lightning, and that's it. No more detail. No attempt to describe how this happened or what it looked like beyond the blur of metaphor, because how do you describe something so far outside human experience? so beyond fabric thread count or light refraction. But what if it wasn't metaphor? What if it was matter, actual physical transformation? Ancient readers certainly thought so. The early church fathers took the description literally, seeing the glowing garments, not as symbolic, but as the visible radiation of divine energy. Christ, for a brief moment, revealed not just his divine identity, but what divinity does to everything it touches, even cloth. This might sound strange, but it wouldn't have been strange to the ancient world. In Greco-Roman traditions, gods often radiated light. Apollo's chariot streaked fire across the sky. Zeus descended in lightning. In Egyptian iconography, pharaohs wore garments woven with gold thread, light made wearable. Holiness in nearly every ancient culture shines. The Hebrew Bible echoes this too. When Moses comes down from Sinai, his face glows so brightly that the people beg him to wear a veil. Even the residue of glory was too much. And remember, Moses wasn't divine. He was just close enough to brush against it. So if Moses shimmered after a conversation with God, what would happen to fabric in contact with divinity itself? This question fascinated later mystics, especially within Eastern Orthodoxy. Some believed Jesus' garments on the mountain were the same ones he wore daily, but transfigured alongside him. Others speculated that his entire body emitted light, and the clothes merely reflected it like a lantern casting its glow through thin cloth. One obscure tradition from the Syriac Church suggests the light was so powerful it rewrote matter, altering the very structure of the fabric at the molecular level. Now, this is long before molecules were a thing anyone could name, but the intuition was there: light, not just as symbol, but as transformation. A kind of heavenly radiation that could touch stone, skin, and thread alike. And here's where the story gets even stranger. In early Christian art, especially in the Byzantine era, Jesus is often depicted during the Transfiguration, wearing garments of white or gold, with rays of light emerging from his body in sharp geometric patterns. These rays don't gently suggest glow. They slice the air. They fracture the image. You can practically hear them. But why focus on the clothing? Why not just describe the face? Because clothing in Jewish tradition wasn't trivial. Garments signified identity, status, holiness. Priests wore detailed robes with precise colors and fabrics. The high priest's garments were sacred enough that touching them improperly risked death. Clothing could mark you as holy or unclean. It could be a form of worship. And in apocalyptic literature, garments mattered even more. The book of Daniel describes a man clothed in linen whose face is like lightning. Revelation tells of Christ returning in robes dipped in blood, but shining with glory. In these texts, clothing isn't ornamental. It's theological. It tells you who you're dealing with. There's even a theory, obscure but deeply poetic, that the glowing garments represent the lost glory of Eden. That when Adam and Eve were first created, they too were clothed in light. Not tunics of skin, but radiance. And that when they fell, the light faded. Nakedness was not just about shame, but the loss of that original glow. The Transfiguration in this view becomes a moment of reversal, a glimpse of what humanity was and what it might be again. And yet, for all its brightness, the moment fades. When the disciples descend the mountain with Jesus, he looks normal again. No glow, no shimmer. The blinding white is gone. Back to sandals, dust, and ordinary cloth. But they remember. The flash remains behind their eyelids. The memory of fabric turned into fire. One open question that continues to puzzle scholars is this: if the garments glowed, did anything else? Did the mountain itself shimmer? Did the plants catch the light? Were there shadows at all, or did the brightness consume them? The text doesn't say. It focuses solely on Jesus and his clothes. as if to keep our eyes fixed on the central mystery, as if to say this wasn't a cosmic light show, it was revelation, and perhaps that's the most haunting part. That even the mundane, the stitched tunic of a carpenter, the hem that brushed against the road, could in a single breath be transfigured. That holiness doesn't need a cathedral, it needs a moment. So the next time you catch the sun glinting off someone's collar, or watch candlelight catch the folds of a robe in an old painting, maybe remember this once, for just a moment, fabric turned to light. And 3 men saw glory not through fire or thunder, but through cotton linen and a flash of impossible brightness. The light wasn't just bright, it was presence. Tangible, overwhelming, alive. Not the kind of glow that sits politely in the background like a candle in a cathedral, but the kind that surrounds, envelopes, and whispers without words, "This is not yours to control." To understand what the disciples experienced on that mountain, you have to step back, not just to Moses or Elijah, but deeper into one of the most potent and rarely discussed currents in Jewish thought, the tradition of the Shekinah. The word itself doesn't appear in the Hebrew Bible. It was born later in the swirling world of rabbinic literature and mystical midrashim. But the idea behind it had always been there, burning in the background. Shekinah comes from the Hebrew root shakan, meaning to dwell or to reside. It referred to the visible, felt presence of God, often described as radiant, cloud-like, and fearsome. The Shekinah wasn't just where God lived. It was God in motion. Not essence, but emanation. Not personhood, but presence. When the Israelites built the tabernacle in the wilderness, a cloud descended over it, and the glory of the Lord filled the space. That was Shekinah. When Solomon finished the temple, and smoke filled the inner court so densely, the priests had to leave again Shekinah. It wasn't a metaphor. It was a phenomenon, a force. And now, centuries later, that same presence seems to descend once more. Not on a tabernacle, not on an altar, but on a man, on a mountain. Some scholars believe the gospel writers knew exactly what they were doing. That by describing the cloud, the light, the overwhelming fear of the disciples, they were invoking the Shekinah tradition, signaling to readers steeped in Hebrew memory that this was that. The same glory, the same unapproachable brilliance that had once rested between cherubim over the ark, was now surrounding Jesus. That's not just theological poetry. That's spiritual dynamite. Because if the Shekinah is present, that means the sacred geography has shifted. The Holy of Holies is no longer inside a temple made of stone. It's standing barefoot on a mountain glowing from within. The divine presence isn't visiting, it's embodied. That changes everything. There's an obscure midrash that tells of the Shekinah withdrawing from the temple when Israel fell into idolatry, departing in 10 stages, until it hovered far from Jerusalem, watching from a distance. The hope of the prophets was that one day the Shekinah would return, that God's glory would dwell again among the people, not as smoke and thunder, but as healing and peace. So when Jesus is transfigured, radiating light enveloped in a cloud, and affirmed by the divine voice, the implication is radical: the Shekinah has come back. Not to a building, to flesh, to someone who walks, speaks, suffers, to someone you could, if you dared, reach out and touch. This reframes everything. Jesus isn't just shining because he's special. He's shining because he's hosting the glory. Or more than that, he is the glory. And the garments, the lightning, the voice from the cloud. All classic indicators of Shekinah presence. If you were a first-century Jew reading these texts or hearing them read aloud, you would have felt the echo instantly. This wasn't a new story. It was the continuation of an old one, a fulfillment. Still, there's a tension. The Shekinah was never fully safe. It was beautiful, yes, but also dangerous. To stand too close was to risk death. That's why only priests entered the inner sanctum. That's why Moses had to veil his face. That's why the disciples fall down overcome. And yet Jesus doesn't turn them away. He touches them, tells them not to be afraid. The very light that once scorched the edges of Sinai now offers comfort. This perhaps is the quiet revolution of the Transfiguration. The Shekinah has not only returned, it has gentled. No longer a fire you can't touch, but a light you can follow. An early Christian mystic named Macarius of Egypt once wrote that the glory which once filled the temple now fills the hearts of believers. That the Transfiguration wasn't just a one-time event, it was a preview, a promise. That someday those who walk in the light will shine with it too. But not everyone agreed. Later, theologians wrestled with the implications. If the Shekinah could dwell in Christ, could it dwell in others in the church? In individual souls, the questions were too mystical for some, too uncontainable, and so slowly the Shekinah faded from mainstream doctrine, tucked back into the vault of Jewish memory, referenced but rarely explored. Still, the imagery lingers. A cloud, a voice, a light that makes men tremble and soil their sandals. And here's the part that keeps returning in whispers: the Transfiguration was not for the crowd. It wasn't a sermon or a public display. It was private, intimate. 3 witnesses. 1 radiant truth. Seen in secret, carried in silence. The Shekinah didn't explode onto the world stage. It crept back in like dawn through cracked shutters. So when you picture that mountain, don't just see brightness. See return. See fulfillment. See the glory that once filled tabernacles now robed in human skin. And know that for one brief moment, the disciples didn't just follow the Messiah. They saw the glory and lived. The light didn't come from somewhere, it was Him. That's the detail that keeps unsettling you. The Gospels don't describe Jesus as being bathed in light. He doesn't step into radiance. The brightness pours from within. His face, his clothing, his entire being erupts into a glory that feels less like a momentary shift and more like a curtain pulling back. And that leads to one of the most electrifying questions in all of Christian theology. Was the Transfiguration a glimpse not of what Jesus would become, but of what He had always been, not a transformation, a revelation? The idea of Christ's pre-existence runs like a golden thread through early Christian texts, particularly the Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Word, he writes, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Jesus, in this framing, doesn't just show up in Bethlehem. He was before the beginning. Not created, eternal. Not anointed into godhood, but divine from before time. But what does that look like? The Transfiguration might be the only moment during Jesus' earthly ministry when that hidden reality cracks through the surface. A radiant breach. Not just a hint or a metaphor, but a full-blown manifestation of pre-incarnate glory. The Jesus who stood on that mountain may have looked more like the Word who hovered over the waters in Genesis than the teacher who walked the dusty roads of Galilee. Some early commentators, particularly in the Alexandrian school, believed this moment revealed the divine Logos, not simply in its incarnate form, but in its eternal brightness. They saw the Transfiguration as Jesus briefly stepping outside the constraints of flesh and time, revealing a form not limited by hunger dust or weariness, the way He was before He took on the fragility of birth. And it wasn't just a theological exercise. It was a warning shot to the disciples. The man they followed wasn't just a prophet. He was the burning bush, the creative breath the light of the world before the world had light. Of course, not everyone agreed. Others, particularly those in the Antiochene tradition, were uncomfortable with the idea of Jesus peeling off his humanity to show something more divine underneath. That sounded too much like shape-shifting. They preferred to see the Transfiguration as the glorification of his human nature, proof that flesh could shine without ceasing to be flesh, that his radiance wasn't a return to a past form, but a foreshadowing of what resurrection glory might look like for all the redeemed. Still, the mystery lingered. Even the disciples must have sensed it. One minute, they're walking with their friend, their rabbi. The next, they're witnessing a being of pure light, one who speaks with the dead, commands clouds, and triggers divine thunder. It must have felt like suddenly realizing your traveling companion is actually a star disguised in sandals. One obscure hymn from the 2nd century, found in the Odes of Solomon, speaks of a radiant figure who put on flesh like a garment, but never removed the robe of light beneath. The implication is profound, that Jesus' divinity was never truly hidden, just muted, wrapped, swaddled not just at birth but throughout his ministry, until for a single moment he let the edge of that light slip into human sight. This would explain the disciples' terror. It wasn't just brightness, it was recognition. Not the face they knew, but the truth behind it. And this isn't the last time the New Testament hints at such glory. In Revelation, John describes seeing the risen Christ, not gentle or veiled, but with eyes like fire feet, like bronze, and a face shining like the sun. Sound familiar it should. It's the Transfiguration again, but turned all the way up. No veil, no cloud, just glory unfiltered. And that perhaps is what the mountain moment was always pointing toward. A dress rehearsal, a preview, a crack in the linear timeline through which eternity leaked. Not a vision of who Jesus might become, but a revelation of who he always was and still is. One could argue that this glimpse was necessary. The road ahead was dark, filled with betrayal, denial, agony. The disciples would watch their radiant rabbi beaten, mocked, and hung like a criminal. They needed to remember the light, to hold that image when the blood started flowing. But maybe it wasn't just for them. Maybe the Transfiguration was a moment for us. A single wordless answer to the question, who was he really? Not a philosopher, not a miracle worker, not a revolutionary, but glory itself housed in breath and bone. The fire that spoke from the bush, the radiance that hovered over the ark, the word that called galaxies into being, standing there barefoot on a mountain shining with the light of eternity, just for a moment, and then back to dust, back to footsteps and sweat and parables. But the light remained, not visible, but remembered, hidden, like a flame behind a curtain, waiting to blaze again. You don't stage a cosmic light show for no reason. You don't summon long-dead prophets, peel back the curtain of time, and speak from within a glowing cloud just because the weather's nice. The Transfiguration wasn't random. It came at a specific moment in the story, a pivot point, a breath before the plunge. Because immediately after this, everything gets darker. In all three synoptic Gospels, the Transfiguration occurs right after Jesus begins to speak openly about his coming death. For the first time, he tells his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem, suffer many things, be rejected, and be killed. Peter predictably flips out. He rebukes Jesus, rebukes him, like a child telling a parent they're not allowed to die. And Jesus in turn offers one of the most chilling lines in Scripture. "Get behind me, Satan." That's the emotional backdrop. Confusion, denial, fear, and then the mountain. One moment they're arguing about suffering, the next they're witnessing impossible glory. It's hard not to feel the deliberate rhythm here. The revelation of death, then the revelation of light, then the road to the cross. Like the story takes a deep breath of starlight before diving into shadow, and you have to wonder, was it for Jesus or for them? Some theologians argue the Transfiguration served as a kind of reassurance for the disciples, a flash of the end before the beginning of the end, a divine trust me before the storm hits. Because what's coming next, betrayal, arrest, crucifixion, will shake them to their core. Their teacher will look weak, defeated, even cursed. But they've seen this. They've seen who he really is. The light might dim, but they'll know what burns beneath the surface. There's also a strategic element. By placing the Transfiguration at this precise moment, the Gospel writers are building narrative tension. You're moving from glory to suffering, not the other way around. From mountaintop to valley, from vision to blood. That's not how most stories go. Usually the pattern is trial, then reward. But here the reward comes first. The light comes before the darkness. As if to say, you'll forget this soon, but don't. Hold it in your bones. You'll need it. And Jesus himself, did he need it? It's easy to forget that he was human, that he felt fear, that he wept, sweat bled, that Gethsemane was still to come. So maybe the Transfiguration wasn't just a moment of divine unveiling, it was a moment of divine strengthening. A whisper from beyond, you are still mine. Keep going. One obscure interpretation from an early Syriac Christian tradition suggests that the conversation between Jesus, Moses, and Elijah was not just casual heavenly chit-chat, it was encouragement. They were preparing him for what lay ahead, reminding him of the mission, supporting him like spiritual midwives before the hardest part of the journey. That would explain why they appear now, not earlier, not later. Not at the baptism, not during the Sermon on the Mount, but here between the first mention of death and the actual road to it. It also reframes Peter's terrified suggestion to build 3 tents. Maybe it wasn't about making camp. Maybe he sensed what was coming. Maybe he was trying to stay in the light, delay the descent, hold back the tide. Let's not go to Jerusalem. Let's live here, in the glow, with the prophets. Let's stay radiant. But that's never how the story goes. The light doesn't prevent the suffering. It doesn't cancel the cross. It doesn't fix what's coming. It simply reveals who is going through it. The Jesus who will be beaten, mocked, and killed is the same Jesus who glowed like the sun. There's no transformation, only veiling and unveiling. And here's where things get especially strange. Because this isn't the only time something like this happens near the end. At the resurrection, Jesus is again surrounded by light. His clothes are again dazzling. Angels appear in white, and those who see him fall in awe. But the Transfiguration comes before all that, like a mirror image, a preview. This has led some scholars to argue that the Transfiguration is a kind of resurrection before the resurrection, a sneak peek, not of what Jesus will become, but what he already is. So when the crucifixion comes, when hope collapses, there is this memory like a coal buried in ash. He is more than this pain. He is light. And still the Gospels move on. Immediately after the descent, Jesus tells the disciples again about his death. And again, they don't understand. The glow has faded, the cloud is gone, the voice has fallen silent, and reality feels heavy again. But they carry the mountain with them, even if they don't realize it. So the next time someone asks why the Transfiguration happened then, at that exact point in the story, You can say this because the soul needs memory before it needs endurance, because glory is easier to endure than silence, because sometimes the only way to survive the valley is to remember the mountaintop. And maybe, just maybe, that's still true. You've just seen the impossible. Not imagined it, not dreamed it, not heard about it secondhand. You watched a man erupt into light, speak with long-dead prophets, and be enveloped by the voice of God. And then, as you're still shaking, still trying to put your lungs back together, Jesus turns to you and says, "Tell no one." Not just wait until they ask. Not be careful how you share it. But a direct, unambiguous command: do not speak of what you've seen until the Son of Man has risen from the dead. It's one of those gospel moments that makes you squint. Why silence? Why bury the most electrifying event in the story under a veil of secrecy? This isn't the only time Jesus orders quiet. Throughout the Gospels, he frequently tells people not to spread word of his miracles. After healing lepers, after casting out demons, after raising the dead. It's become known in scholarly circles as the Messianic secret, a term that sounds like the title of a lost Dan Brown novel, but is in fact a real theological puzzle. At first glance, the command seems counterintuitive. If you're the Messiah, isn't the point to be known, to proclaim, perform, gather, and grow? Wouldn't a transfigured Jesus glowing like a divine light bulb be excellent PR? But Jesus doesn't think that way. There are theories, of course. One common explanation is that Jesus wanted to avoid political misunderstanding. In a world teetering on the edge of revolt, announcing yourself as the glowing prophetic heir to Moses and Elijah could be taken poorly. You don't want Rome to panic before the story has a chance to unfold. And Jesus, being no fool, knew that timing mattered. A premature spotlight might spark the wrong kind of fire. But there's a deeper possibility, one rooted not in politics, but in perception. Maybe the moment on the mountain wasn't meant to be broadcast because it couldn't be understood. Not yet. Not fully. To tell of it before the resurrection would be like handing someone a match in the middle of a hurricane. The light would vanish. The meaning would be lost. Even the disciples didn't grasp it. They descend the mountain, confused, whispering among themselves about what rising from the dead could possibly mean. They'd seen the light, but they hadn't absorbed it. Not yet. The experience was too raw, too soon, too far from the cross. Some early church fathers believed the command to remain silent was a test, a sacred trust. The 3 disciples had been given a glimpse of glory, and now they had to carry it quietly, to hold the memory without the validation of others. A kind of spiritual training in secrecy, which, let's be honest, most of us would fail by breakfast. There's a mystical tradition, too, mostly hidden in Syriac and Eastern writings, that suggests Jesus' command was not about fear of misunderstanding, but about protection. That speaking too soon of divine glory could actually cause harm. That premature revelation could unravel fragile faith. Or worse, could tempt the speaker to pride. Because what's more seductive than the knowledge that you were there, that you saw what no one else did? Silence in this view isn't just obedience, it's mercy. And then there's the possibility that Jesus wasn't hiding anything at all. He was waiting for death, for resurrection, for the world to be ready to see the light not just as spectacle but as sacrifice. Because until the cross, the transfiguration is just a flash, a confusing miracle. But after the tomb is empty, it becomes something else entirely. A confirmation, a memory that explains the impossible. Still, the open question nags, did they really keep silent? Matthew and Mark seem to suggest they did. Luke's Gospel specifically says they told no one at that time what they had seen. But oral tradition is a slippery thing. Perhaps they whispered it to each other on the long walks. Perhaps they shared it in tears after the crucifixion. Perhaps after the resurrection, they told it not as braggarts, but as survivors finally understanding what the mountain had meant. And maybe that's the point. That there are some truths too big for the moment. Some revelations that must be buried like seeds, hidden in memory, watered with time. And only later, after the pain, after the confusion, after the light has gone out, do they bloom. There's a strange comfort in that, because it suggests that silence is not failure. Sometimes it's preparation, a space for meaning to ripen, for mystery to unfold, not in noise, but in quiet. So if you're holding a truth you don't yet know how to share, you're in good company. Peter, James, and John walked back down that mountain with their mouths closed and their hearts blazing. They were told to wait. And when the time came, they didn't just speak, they remembered. Every word, every glimmer, every breath of cloud. And the world was never the same. You've heard the story so many times, it feels like settled fact. Jesus took Peter, James, and John up a mountain. The Transfiguration occurred. They alone saw it. 3 witnesses. The inner circle. No one else. But what if that wasn't the whole story? The Gospels are silent about anyone else being present. Painfully, almost suspiciously silent. No mention of other disciples watching from below, no word of local shepherds glimpsing strange light on the summit. No testimonies from curious strangers. It's presented as a private moment, 3 men, 1 revelation. And yet something about that feels fragile. Let's start with the cultural context. In Jewish law, major truths were established on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. The number 3 wasn't arbitrary, it was legal, sacred, symbolic. You needed 3 people to validate a claim, especially one as outrageous as our teacher turned into light and spoke with dead prophets on a mountaintop. If only 1 disciple had been there, the story might have been dismissed. But 3 that lent just enough credibility to keep it alive. Still, 3 doesn't mean only. There's an ancient Christian tradition buried in the writings of the early Egyptian desert fathers that hints at more people having witnessed the event silently. That others may have seen the light from afar but didn't understand it. That the glow at the summit was not entirely invisible to those below, like a strange aurora just out of reach. Imagine the other disciples left behind at the mountain's base watching the sun set and suddenly noticing an unnatural brilliance atop the peak. Maybe they whispered among themselves, wondering what was happening. Maybe they were told to stay put. Maybe they didn't speak of it later because they didn't know what they'd seen. It's speculative, yes, but not without foundation. In the book of Exodus, when Moses ascended Sinai, the people remained below. They saw the lightning, heard the thunder, felt the tremble of something holy. They didn't see the tablets being carved or the divine hand, but they witnessed the mountaintop burning. Could the same have happened here? One obscure text from the Ethiopic tradition, a version of the Gospel of the Hebrews long since lost to time, makes a cryptic comment. And others looked upon the mountain and trembled, though they knew not what passed. Whether this was a late addition or a faithful fragment of early oral tradition is debated, but it lingers like incense. Then there's the question of who wrote about the Transfiguration. None of the synoptic Gospels were written by eyewitnesses. These stories were passed on, edited, remembered, which means that somewhere between the event and the page, there may have been other accounts, ones that didn't survive. Versions told by people who saw something, even if they didn't fully understand it. And what about John? He was there. One of the 3. Yet his gospel says nothing of the Transfiguration. Not a whisper, not a verse. And John, of all people, seems obsessed with the idea of glory. His entire account frames Jesus as the Word made flesh, the light shining in darkness, the one who reveals the Father. If anyone should have included the mountaintop moment, it was him. Some scholars argue that he did, but not directly. In the opening chapter, John writes, "We have seen his glory, the glory as of the only begotten from the Father, full of grace and truth." No mountain is mentioned, no glowing robes. But the language feels loaded, as if hinting at a memory too sacred to describe plainly. A veiled reference buried in poetry. There's even a theory, strange fringe and quietly seductive, that the Transfiguration was witnessed by more than just people, that angels were present, watching silently, that creation itself bore witness. The wind, the soil, the birds nesting in the nearby crags, that the mountain remembered, that its stones held the glow long after the figures disappeared. And if that sounds far-fetched, consider this: the Gospels repeatedly speak of stones crying out of stars, announcing birth, of earthquakes marking death. Why should the Transfiguration be any different? There's also the uncomfortable possibility that more people did witness it, but their accounts were silenced, edited out of the final gospel narratives, to preserve focus, clarity, or theological coherence. Early church leaders, eager to emphasize the special role of Peter, James, and John, may have trimmed the story to its core witnesses. That's not conspiracy. That's how sacred history often gets shaped. Not by what happened, but by what could be told cleanly, memorably, liturgically. And yet that doesn't mean the extra eyes weren't there. Because light has a way of spilling over. It creeps beyond the veil. It reflects in the eyes of those who weren't meant to see. It burns its way into collective memory, even when no one talks about it. So maybe it's true 3 men saw him transformed. They saw his glory, heard the voice, fell to the ground, and walked back down with silence stitched into their mouths. But maybe, just maybe, others glimpsed it too. Not clearly, not fully, but enough to know something sacred had happened. A glow on a mountain. A sound with no source, a silence too full to be empty. And in the end, maybe the number of witnesses doesn't matter. Maybe what matters is that the light was seen. And once seen, it could never be fully hidden again. You step back from the mountaintop for a moment, not to forget it, but to frame it. Because sometimes to understand a mystery, you have to look sideways, across borders, across cultures, into the stories told by other peoples about their own radiant figures, their own luminous encounters, their own transfigured ones. And when you do, something unsettling happens. You begin to see reflections, not copies, not counterfeits, but echoes, half-familiar glimmers of the same strange light. Take, for instance, the Buddha. In early Mahayana texts, particularly in the Lalitavistara Sutra, the Buddha is described as radiating a golden aura after his enlightenment. His body shines with 32 marks of divinity, and light bursts from his mouth when he speaks sacred truths. At one point, he levitates surrounded by glowing halos and worshipped by celestial beings. These stories aren't metaphors. They are reported as history, cosmic history, layered with myth, yes, but meant to be taken seriously by the faithful. In ancient Greek tradition, we have the apotheosis, the moment when a mortal becomes divine. Heracles, after completing his labors and suffering death, is lifted to Olympus. His body is consumed by flame, and in its place, a radiant version ascends. Even Romulus, founder of Rome, was said to have vanished into a storm cloud, transformed into the god Quirinus. Eyewitnesses report seeing his body vanish into light. Sound familiar. Then there's Zoroaster. Persian tradition claims he was once enveloped by a divine flame that did not burn him. His face glowed so brightly that those around him had to avert their eyes. He received revelations from Ahura Mazda, surrounded by shining beings and an otherworldly brilliance. Again, the combination of voice light and transformation. Or consider the Egyptian pharaohs who claimed descent from Ra, the sun god. Their divine right to rule was often depicted with luminous crowns, radiant skin in gold-painted tombs, and eyes like burning coals. The Ka, the soul spirit, was portrayed as a luminous double, a spiritual twin that ascended to join the stars. We'll revisit that idea later. Even in Norse mythology, Odin is said to have undergone a form of transfiguration, hanging on the world tree, sacrificing himself to himself, and returning transformed, filled with hidden knowledge and power. Not light in the literal sense, perhaps, but illumination in every other form. So what does this mean? Were the gospel writers copying? Did the Transfiguration story evolve from earlier mythic frameworks repurposed for a new religious movement? Some scholars in the 19th and early 20th centuries certainly thought so. They combed through these parallels, eagerly drawing lines from India to Greece to Galilee, eager to deconstruct the miracle into something familiar. But this approach always stumbles on one crucial fact. The gospel accounts are not written like myths. They're too abrupt, too restrained, no extended poetry, no divine beings announcing Jesus' transformation with choirs and symbols, no grand rituals or public witnesses. It's quiet, brief, terrifyingly understated. The comparison, if anything, highlights how different the Transfiguration is from the radiant myths around it. Still, the parallels won't go away, and maybe they're not meant to. Maybe the human psyche, regardless of continent or culture, has always longed for a glimpse of something more. A moment when the veil lifts and the divine leaks through. Light pouring from flesh. Mortality bathed in something eternal. One open question that lingers is whether these stories arose independently or from shared roots. Some argue for a kind of archetypal memory, a Jungian idea that we carry within us the blueprint of transformation, that across cultures we instinctively recognize the moment when a human becomes more than human, when suffering meets glory, when a face shines. There's also the possibility of spiritual convergence, that different peoples reaching upward sometimes brush against the same truth, that Moses on Sinai and Zoroaster in the fire and the Buddha beneath the tree are all echoes of a singular light refracted through history. And then there's the alternative, that the Transfiguration isn't one story among many, but the event all others dimly remembered. That when the disciples saw Jesus radiant, they weren't witnessing something new, but the fulfillment of every myth, every prophecy, every shining figure ever dreamed of by trembling mortals. The real thing at last. The original light. One ancient Christian poet wrote, "All myths are shadows of Christ's form cast backward through time." A bold claim, but a comforting one too. That the longing of all nations finds its answer not in a story, but in a man on a mountain surrounded by light. So maybe you don't need to resolve the parallels. Maybe they're meant to be there like stars around a sun. Beautiful, suggestive, but not the source. And if some of them shine too brightly, don't be afraid. That just means they remember something too. You'd expect to find it everywhere. The moment Jesus shone like the sun flanked by Moses and Elijah, voice of God thundering through a cloud, it's the kind of scene tailor-made for stained glass mosaics and cathedral domes. And yet, when you sift through the remnants of early Christian art, the catacombs, the carvings, the surviving frescoes, something is missing. The Transfiguration is strangely rare. For the first few centuries of Christian visual culture, the image is mostly absent. No gleaming garments, no mountaintop meetings, no golden rays. You find Jesus as the Good Shepherd, feeding multitudes, healing the blind, even raising Lazarus, but not glowing in divine light. This absence has puzzled scholars for generations. Was the story not widely known? Was it considered too sacred to depict? Or was there something about the Transfiguration that simply didn't translate well into early artistic language? One theory suggests a practical reason: the Transfiguration. With its complex elements, a mountain, 3 radiant figures, 3 terrified disciples, a divine voice from a cloud, is difficult to compress into a single frame. Unlike, say, the crucifixion or the feeding of the 5,000, which present clear, dramatic focal points, the Transfiguration resists simplification. It's not action, it's revelation. And revelation is notoriously hard to illustrate. But the issue goes deeper than composition. The early church was still working out how to depict Jesus at all. Was he fully divine, fully human? How do you paint someone who is both infinite and incarnate? Many early Christian images showed Jesus as a youthful philosopher or a stoic shepherd. These were safe symbolic templates borrowed from Greco-Roman iconography. A shining, transformed Jesus, however, posed a more dangerous challenge. It demanded a visual language the church had not yet agreed upon. And then, there was the issue of when the Transfiguration mattered most. In the early centuries, Christianity was a persecuted religion. Believers met in secret, worshipped underground, and clung to the cross as the central symbol of hope. The imagery was focused on suffering, martyrdom, and endurance. Glory came later. The Transfiguration, with its radiant Christ and ancient prophets, belonged to a different tone, a tone that the early church simply wasn't ready for. Still, it wasn't entirely absent. In the 6th century, the veil begins to lift. One of the earliest known depictions appears in the apse mosaic of the Church of the Transfiguration on Mount Sinai. No coincidence there, within the monastery of St. Catherine. There Christ stands in a shimmering blue mandorla, a full-body halo shaped like an almond. His garments, white arms, outstretched rays shooting from him like spokes of the sun. Moses and Elijah flank him upright and dignified. Below, Peter, James, and John have fallen, twisting, shielding their eyes, their bodies contorted in awe and confusion. It's not just a scene. It's a theological statement. This image becomes a template. You see variations of it throughout Byzantine art, especially in Eastern Orthodox iconography. The mandorla remains often layered in shades of blue and gold, suggesting not just light, but the mystery of light, the kind that can't be seen directly. Christ's face is calm, still, utterly unbothered by the chaos around him. One obscure detail in these icons is the positioning of the disciples. They never stand, always falling, kneeling, covering their eyes. Their inability to remain upright becomes part of the message. Divine glory cannot be absorbed casually. It flattens, it overwhelms. And always the light is centered on Jesus, not above him, not behind him, but from him. That was a radical artistic move. In Greco-Roman images of God's light comes from the environment. Zeus rides lightning. Apollo carries the sun. But here the light is personal, intrinsic. Jesus is the source. By the medieval period, the Transfiguration becomes more common in Western art as well, especially in illuminated manuscripts. The scene is often nestled between depictions of the baptism and the crucifixion, a visual link between water glory and blood. You see this triad in the Book of Kells, the Rabelais Gospels, and later in Renaissance altarpieces. But even then, the Transfiguration remains relatively niche compared to other events in Jesus' life. It never quite takes center stage. Always radiant, always reverent, but slightly aloof. Like a guest who enters the gallery through a side door and glows quietly in the corner. One possible reason, its ambiguity. The crucifixion offers clear emotional cues: grief, sacrifice, redemption. The Nativity brings joy and awe. But the Transfiguration, it's unsettling. Neither joyful nor sorrowful. It's luminous, yes, but also disorienting. It doesn't resolve, it reveals. And revelation, when painted, tends to linger too long in the viewer's gaze. Still, the impact of those early icons endures. In the Eastern tradition, the Feast of the Transfiguration is one of the 12 great feasts. The icon is venerated. The light is remembered. The message is clear: Christ's divinity is not a future reward. It's a present reality hidden, waiting to be seen. So the next time you wander through a chapel past saints and cherubs and spot a scene with a man shining in a burst of divine geometry, while others collapse around him, stop and look closer. You found it. The visual echo of that strange, quiet moment on a mountain, where time paused, where light spoke, where glory wore skin. You've read the story in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, brief flashes of brilliance clouds a voice. But what if there were other versions, other fragments, not retellings exactly, but strange cryptic reflections scattered through the texts that didn't make it into the final cut? Not rejected for being false necessarily, but for being too much, too mystical, too difficult to control. Enter the Gospel of Thomas. It's not a gospel in the narrative sense. No virgin birth, no crucifixion, no transfiguration scene, not directly. Just 114 sayings or logia attributed to Jesus. Some sound familiar. Others sound like riddles spoken by someone half asleep and half somewhere else. You read it and feel like you're eavesdropping on something private. One of the most haunting lines comes early in saying 2. Let him who seeks continue seeking until he finds. When he finds, he will become troubled. When he becomes troubled, he will be astonished, and he will rule over the all. It's not a parable. It's a spiral, a process. And many have wondered if it describes not a path of belief, but of revelation. A gradual unveiling. The kind that feels uncomfortably close to what the disciples may have experienced on that mountaintop. First the climb, then confusion, then astonishment, then silence, then change. There's another passage later in Thomas that's even more provocative. If you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you. It sounds almost radioactive. As if there's light within each person, not metaphorical light, but something real, hidden, dangerous, sacred, and the consequences of keeping it buried are catastrophic. This, say some interpreters, is the true transfiguration, not of Christ alone, but of humanity, of you. That what was seen on the mountain wasn't just revelation, it was an invitation. You might ask, if Thomas never describes the Transfiguration, why does it feel like it knows it? Because the themes are too similar to ignore. Light, hiddenness, silence. Revelation as something not imposed from above but uncovered from within. These are not contradictions of the synoptic accounts. They are deep echoes, unofficial, unsettling, and somehow intimate. Some early Christian sects, particularly the Valentinian Gnostics, believed that Christ's true teachings were given only to a few, and that Thomas was the keeper of those secret sayings. Not secrets in the conspiratorial sense, but in the mystical one. Truths that only made sense once you'd seen the light for yourself, once you'd stood on your own mountain. There's a curious line in Saying 13 where Jesus pulls Thomas aside, away from the other disciples, and speaks something privately into his ear. When they ask what he said, Thomas replies, "If I tell you even one of the things which he told me, you will pick up stones and throw them at me." It's cryptic, chilling. Whatever he heard wasn't for public consumption. It wasn't safe. Could this be connected to the silence that followed the Transfiguration? That same trembling awareness that what had been seen or heard was too heavy to share. Scholars disagree. Some dismiss the Gospel of Thomas as a later invention, a spiritual remix with no connection to the real events. Others argue it preserves an oral tradition even older than the canonical Gospels. A window into the esoteric teachings Jesus may have given to his closest friends, things too deep for public sermons. One obscure commentary suggests that the Gospel of Thomas functions like the mountain itself. It offers no map, no context, just elevation. You have to climb it, say by saying. And somewhere in that climb, a light begins to flicker. Not above you, but inside. Which brings us back to the Transfiguration. What if, for just a moment, the disciples didn't see Jesus change but themselves? What if the light wasn't just his divinity breaking through, but theirs responding to it, a mirror moment? A spiritual spark caught between flesh and glory. That might explain why they couldn't speak of it afterward. Not just because they were told not to, but because they had no words. How do you explain being seen by a light that doesn't just illuminate you, but rewrites you? Thomas doesn't describe that scene, but he lives in its shadow. His gospel is saturated with the aftermath of glory. The burn behind the eyelids, the voice still echoing after the cloud vanishes. In this view, the Transfiguration wasn't an exception. It was a glimpse of what is always true, always present, always hidden until for a breath it isn't. So maybe Thomas didn't write about the mountain because he was the mountain. Because the moment left him so changed, he could only speak in riddles after that, in spirals, in silence. And maybe if you listen carefully enough, you'll hear it too. Not in the thunder, not even in the light, but in the pause that follows. You've heard it whispered in mystical corners. Not in Sunday school, not in seminary, rarely in pulpits, but in the forgotten pages of early Christian mystics buried beneath layers of doctrine and centuries of nervous redaction. The theory that Jesus, the man who walked, wept, and was crucified, had a counterpart, a heavenly twin, a double. Not a metaphor, not a look-alike, but a radiant, eternal presence that walked with him, hovered beside him, or perhaps was him hidden in plain sight. And for a brief moment on a mountaintop, the two were seen together. Or seen as one. This isn't mainstream theology, to be clear. It's speculative, mysterious. But it's there, scattered through the early centuries, like fragments of glass after a stained glass window has shattered. The Valentinian Gnostics were especially fond of the idea. They spoke of the anthropos, the primordial human, the divine image of God, unfallen, undivided, who existed before time, before matter. Christ, they claimed, was the earthly echo of that cosmic figure. His earthly form was a shadow. His true self lived above the stars. And in their texts, the Transfiguration becomes something more than an unveiling. It becomes a fusion, a moment when the earthly and the heavenly Christ are no longer separate. Not two beings standing side by side, but two realities snapping into alignment like a double exposure in sacred light. It's unsettling, isn't it? Because if that's true, if the shining figure on the mountain was not just a human lit from within, but a glimpse of something pre-existent other, then the disciples weren't just seeing Jesus transfigured, they were seeing reality fold. There are echoes of this in the canonical texts if you know where to look. In Paul's letters, he often refers to Christ as the second Adam, the man from heaven. Not just better than Adam, other than, a being of a different category. In 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says, "Just as we have borne the image of the earthly man, so shall we bear the image of the heavenly man." That heavenly man, glorious, incorruptible, bright as dawn, is the form seen on the mountain. And if we press deeper into the apocryphal realm, the Acts of John contains a passage so bizarre, it reads like dream logic. John says that during Jesus' earthly ministry, he sometimes saw him in two places at once. That he would speak to Jesus in one form only to turn and find him standing elsewhere, shining, silent. At one point he says Jesus had no solid form at all, he was light and voice and mystery. Whether these visions were theological poetry or mystical hallucination is debatable, but they suggest that early Christians wrestled with a Jesus too big to fit inside flesh alone. One obscure Coptic text even refers to the Transfiguration not as a moment of change, but as a reunification. The divine image and the human body rejoined after being temporarily separate. A kind of divine synchronization. For a moment, everything matched, and perhaps this theory, as wild as it sounds, helps explain the intensity of the disciples' response. They didn't just see Jesus shining, they saw something else in him, or beside him, or pouring out of him, something that destabilized reality, something so other that words failed and knees buckled. Peter's offer to build 3 shelters. Maybe it wasn't just a nervous babble. Maybe he was trying to anchor something, to give form to what had none, to build tents for 3 figures, Moses, Elijah, and a Jesus who suddenly didn't look like the man they'd eaten breakfast with just that morning. Of course, traditional theology resists this. The Church Fathers were careful to keep Jesus' divinity and humanity united but not divided. 2 natures, yes, but one person. No cosmic twin, no shadow self. Anything else was heresy. Confusing, dangerous. But the imagery persists. In mystical traditions, particularly in Eastern Christianity, there's the idea of the light of Tabor, a spiritual energy that flows from the transfigured Christ. It's not metaphorical, it's experiential. Monks spoke of seeing it during prayer, feeling it in the bones. The same light the disciples saw glimpsed again centuries later in the stillness of cave-worn monastic silence. And what was that light? Not sunlight, not fire, something else. Something that felt personal, intelligent, a presence. And that brings us back to the heavenly double. Because maybe it wasn't just light. Maybe it was someone. A presence long hidden, now revealed. Not separate, not other, but Christ fully seen. One body, one spirit, one mystery too great for doctrine, too beautiful to dissect. So the next time you read the Transfiguration picture this not a man glowing like a holy nightlight, but a veil torn, a fusion of time and eternity. The earthly Jesus and the heavenly Christ, no longer alternating but united. Shining not just for them, but for us. To remind us of what lies beneath the surface of everything. A double yes, but not a twin. A mirror. And the light is yours too. You've heard them before, those strange, luminous testimonies from people who died and came back. Sometimes on hospital beds, sometimes in roadside wreckage, sometimes in silence, sometimes in full-blown glory. They tell of tunnels, of warmth, of an overwhelming light. A being waiting at the center of it all, radiant, loving, terrifying only in how complete it feels. And if you listen long enough, you start to feel it, a faint shimmer of something familiar. something that echoes a mountain long ago where light exploded from a man's body and the veil between worlds lifted. Could the Transfiguration be the first recorded near-death experience, or perhaps more unsettlingly, could near-death experiences be humanity's echo of that moment? It's not just the brightness, though that alone is striking. People who've had NDEs often say the light was not like any earthly light. It didn't just illuminate, it understood. It had weight, warmth, intention. Just like the light that poured from Jesus on the mountain wasn't environmental. It wasn't sunshine. It was Him. The disciples didn't just see through Him, they were seen by Him. And then there's the voice. In many NDE accounts, there's a voice, sometimes male, sometimes genderless, that speaks without sound. It says things like, "You are loved," or "It is not your time," or sometimes more cryptically, "You must return." The disciples, too, heard a voice not from Jesus but from the cloud. Not thunder, not command. Just 6 words, "This is my Son. Listen to Him." Clear, simple, unmistakable. There are other parallels. Many near-death survivors speak of seeing beings, deceased relatives, unknown guides, or luminous figures that radiate peace. In the Transfiguration, Moses and Elijah appear dead men, radiant and recognizable, calmly speaking to Jesus. They're not wailing ghosts or chaotic apparitions. They're poised, real, present in a way that defies time. One could argue Jesus didn't conjure them. He joined them. One of the more obscure details from Luke's account hints at this, that the 3 were speaking of His departure, which He was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. The Greek word used there is exodos, departure, not death, not end, exit. The same word used for the Israelites leaving Egypt, as if Jesus' path was not toward termination but transition. This language of transition echoes countless NDE testimonies. People don't describe dying, they describe leaving, a journey, not away from life but toward a truer version of it. Some say they felt more alive in the light than they ever did in their bodies, more real, as if the world they'd left was the dream and the glowing presence was home. Theologians have long been wary of comparing NDEs with biblical events. It's easy to see why. The narratives can feel dangerously subjective, anecdotal, and yet the similarities refuse to be ignored. Even secular researchers, doctors, neuroscientists, skeptics have noted how eerily consistent NDE accounts are across cultures, ages, religions. And that consistency often centers around a single motif: light. Not just visual light, experiential light. A light that knows. A light that reveals. A light that says, "Here is who you are," and does so with more truth than any mirror ever could. That kind of light appeared on the mountain. That kind of light was the mountain. One obscure line from a 4th century mystic, Evagrius Ponticus, says the soul, when drawn near to God, remembers its origin in light. Not learns, remembers. As if it had always known. As if the Transfiguration didn't just show who Jesus truly was, but what humanity once was, and might become again. Which brings us to another strange overlap. Some NDE survivors report not just seeing light, but becoming light, dissolving into it, feeling themselves made of it, and for a moment, there's no separation between the self and the presence. It's union, glorious, weightless, frightening in its vastness. And isn't that perhaps what the disciples saw? Not just Jesus glowing, but becoming light itself, dissolving the boundary between matter and mystery. Not a performance, but a transformation into the truth that had always been there. There's even a psychological phenomenon known as the ego death during intense NDEs, where the boundaries of self vanish and the person feels united with something divine, infinite, and knowing. It leaves people unable to describe what they saw, only how they felt, which is exactly the kind of linguistic paralysis that overtakes Peter, James, and John. They don't report what they understood, only what they saw: the light, the terror, the voice. And when it was over, they told no one. Not because they weren't allowed, but maybe because they couldn't. One open question haunts this comparison. If the Transfiguration reflects something echoed in NDEs across millennia, then what does that mean about death itself? Is it possible that Jesus, in revealing his glory, was offering not a demonstration of divinity, but a revelation of what awaits? That the glowing man on the mountain isn't just the destination, but the template. It's a dangerous thought. Too bright, maybe, for doctrine, but hard to ignore. So the next time you hear someone say they saw a light when they were close to death, maybe don't roll your eyes. Maybe they were closer to the mountain than they realized. You've been told it was a miracle, a glorious glimpse of divine power. But what if it wasn't? What if the Transfiguration wasn't meant to inspire awe, but to initiate fear? What if it was a ritual, an esoteric, carefully timed transformation ceremony, and the three disciples weren't just witnesses, but participants? Or worse, test subjects. From the beginning, there's something unnervingly deliberate about the entire scene. Jesus leads Peter, James, and John up a high mountain alone. Not the full 12. Just these three, hand-picked. Why were they the most faithful, the most courageous, or were they the ones most likely to survive what was about to happen? Because what happens next doesn't feel spontaneous. It feels staged, precise. The blinding light, the sudden appearance of long-dead prophets, the booming voice from the cloud, and then silence. Almost like steps in a rite initiatory stations passed in sequence, one after another, with witnesses not fully told what they were seeing, only left to absorb the consequences. In ancient Jewish mysticism, especially the Merkava traditions, the throne chariot visions of Ezekiel and later mystical texts ascending to the divine realm wasn't accidental. It required preparation, fasting, meditation, ritual purity. And when the vision came, it often arrived on a mountain, through light, through sound, through a sense of being unmade. One stepped into the vision not to see God, but to survive God's presence. And that echoes with disturbing clarity on the Mount of Transfiguration. The disciples don't cheer. They don't fall in worship. They fall on their faces in fear. Mark even notes they were terrified. Not amazed, not enlightened, terrified. And then Peter, rambling, suggests building shelters for Jesus, Moses, and Elijah. Why did he believe they would remain? Did he think something was being invoked, something that now needed a place to dwell? The obscure book of Enoch, which was widely read in Jesus' time but later excluded from canon, describes a vision of heaven filled with radiant beings and voices of thunder. It describes those who see the divine realm as forever changed, marked, silenced, broken by the weight of what they encountered. And always there is a cost. So what was the cost on the mountain? What changed in the three men who saw it? It's easy to overlook, but the Transfiguration is followed immediately by suffering. They come down the mountain and are met with chaos, a demon-possessed boy, a failure of faith, confusion. Then Jesus begins to speak again and again of death, of crucifixion, of betrayal. As if the light had not calmed him, but hurried him. As if a countdown had started. In Greco-Roman mystery, cults' initiates were often taken into underground chambers. Lights were shown, sacred names whispered, actors in masks posed as gods. The goal wasn't entertainment, It was transformation. You didn't leave the ritual as the same person who entered. You were expected to die symbolically and be reborn. Maybe that's what Jesus enacted. A sacred unveiling not just of himself, but of them. Maybe Peter, James, and John were pulled into a process of inner disintegration, not for fun, not for power, but to prepare them for what was coming, for what they'd have to survive. Because only those three, those who saw him as light, would also see him broken. They alone would glimpse both ends of the spectrum, glory and agony. And perhaps that was the point. To stretch them so far from one extreme to the other that their souls might snap and then mend. It's also worth noting that ancient Jewish ritual law forbade exposing people to divine phenomena without protection. The high priest alone could enter the Holy of Holies, and even then only once a year and only with smoke to obscure the light. What Jesus does then seems transgressive. He exposes uninitiated men to direct glory. No smoke, no veil, just raw divinity face to face. And what about the location? Some scholars have suggested that the site was chosen not for elevation, but for isolation, a sacred space free from interference, somewhere the rite could be conducted and contained. This leads to an open question: was the transfiguration for Jesus, or for them, did he need to glow? Or did they need to see it? Because in ancient initiation rites, the initiate doesn't understand the ritual until after. They walk through the fire blindly, and only later do the symbols fall into place. Perhaps that's why Jesus told them to tell no one. Not out of secrecy, but because they had nothing yet to say. Their understanding was still forming. The light had entered them, but not yet taken root. Later they would write. They would preach. They would die for this man. But at that moment, they had seen something. Something they weren't ready to carry. And yet they had to. A final unsettling theory comes from a fringe group of mystics who believed the Transfiguration was a kind of warning. Not to others, but to Jesus. That in becoming light, he glimpsed the full cost of his path. That standing with Moses and Elijah wasn't just a reunion, but a confrontation. Both those prophets suffered. Both were rejected. And now their glowing presence was a mirror you too will fall, which raises a darker possibility. What if the Transfiguration was not a celebration, but a funeral, a beautiful, blinding send-off for a man about to walk into death? You've seen paintings of it, haven't you? Golden halos, radiant robes, Christ hovering slightly off the ground, his arms outstretched, bathed in a glory so intense it seems to melt the frame. Artists for centuries have struggled to depict what the Gospels only describe in whispers, a transfigured Jesus too bright for mortal eyes. But perhaps they weren't just trying to capture a single event. Perhaps they were grasping at something else, something yet to come. Something Paul the Apostle, who never saw the Transfiguration, nevertheless described with startling clarity the resurrected body. It's an odd connection at first glance, the mountaintop moment and the end-time promise. But then you start to notice the overlaps, the descriptions, the metaphors, the light, the transformation, the promise that what happened to him might also happen to you. In Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, he writes of a spiritual body raised in glory, imperishable, immortal. Not a ghost, not a vapor, but something transformed. A body capable of existing in both the earthly and heavenly realms. In his letter to the Philippians, he goes further, saying Christ will transform our lowly body to be like his glorious body. There it is. Glorious. Radiant. Changed. Not destroyed, upgraded. So now you look back at that mountain. At the moment when Jesus' clothes turned dazzling white, whiter than any bleach could make them, as Mark puts it, with an oddly modern touch. At his face shining like the sun. At the sheer impossibility of what the disciples were seeing. And you wonder, were they seeing not just who Jesus was, but what he was becoming? Or even more radically, what humanity could become? In Eastern Orthodox theology, there's a concept called theosis. It means deification, not in the sense of becoming a god, but of becoming filled with God's light, transformed, made radiant. And the Transfiguration in that tradition is not an exception, it's a preview, a glimpse of the human body saturated with divine presence. It changes how you read the story. Instead of a momentary spark of divine glory, it becomes a mirror. A window into the future. A future not just for Jesus, but for those who follow him. Those who pass through suffering and death into something brighter. But there's an obscure layer here that makes the idea even stranger. In some early mystical Christian sects, those often branded heretical, there were rumors of light bodies, forms not limited by flesh. They spoke of Jesus appearing after resurrection in different guises, sometimes glowing, sometimes transparent, sometimes even unrecognizable until he chose to reveal himself. Not because he was playing tricks, but because his form had transcended the rules of physicality. Could the Transfiguration have been an early glimpse of that form? A brief rip in the timeline where the future body flickered into the present. There's an odd line in Luke's version of the Transfiguration that adds fuel to the fire. When Moses and Elijah appear, it says they spoke with him about his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Departure in Greek is exodos, yes, like the book, the escape from slavery, the journey through death into freedom. So on that mountain, Jesus isn't just glowing, he's discussing the exit. Not just from life, but from limitation. That word exodos would not have been missed by Jewish readers. It calls back the image of transformation through trial, of crossing a sea, of entering a new land. The parallels are almost too neat. And then there's the callback, subtle but present, to an earlier figure who glowed, Moses. After speaking with God on Sinai, Moses descended with his face shining so brightly that he had to wear a veil, not forever, just until the glow faded. But in Paul's writings, he suggests that Jesus surpasses that glow, that while Moses had a temporary reflection of God's glory, Jesus is that glory. So now the mystery deepens. Was the Transfiguration showing Jesus' future, his past, or was it showing our potential? Because if his glowing form wasn't just a heavenly flex, but a prototype, then everything changes. Suddenly, salvation isn't just rescue, it's renovation. And that adds an almost sci-fi shimmer to the whole idea. You're not just waiting to float off to some invisible heaven. You're waiting to be upgraded, transformed, given a body that pulses with light, that walks through walls, that eats fish yet glows like a star. The question that lingers, of course, is whether the disciples understood any of this. Likely not. They were terrified, overwhelmed, flattened by the experience. But later, after resurrection, after Pentecost, did they look back and see it differently? Did they remember the mountain as more than just spectacle? Did they see it as a promise? There's even a theory, obscure but worth considering, that the Transfiguration was meant to burn an image into their minds, not just of Christ, but of transformation. That in their darkest hours, when they saw his blood, his agony, his broken body, they would recall this moment. The light, the voice, the glory. And remember, this is not the end. There is another body. There is a brighter form. This is not all there is. And maybe that's the lesson for you too. that beyond the pain, the fear, the limits of flesh, there waits a radiance you can barely imagine. A body not of dust, but of light. Not bound by death, but stitched with eternity. And maybe, just maybe, you caught a glimpse of it. Once, on a mountain, when time cracked, and the future stepped through. The moment should have changed everything. A mountaintop revelation, a divine unveiling, a vision of Jesus so luminous that even seasoned fishermen dropped to the ground in fear. And yet, as Christianity hardened into doctrine and institution, something peculiar happened. The Transfiguration, this cosmic crack in the curtain of time, quietly faded into theological obscurity. Not erased, not denied, but neutered, flattened, folded politely into the liturgical calendar as a kind of spiritual appetizer before Lent. A holy moment, yes, but one kept carefully in its place. Why, the simplest explanation is discomfort. The Transfiguration refuses to behave. It's too esoteric for tidy doctrine, too mystical for apologetics, and too visual for creeds made of words. It defies categories. Was it a miracle? A revelation? A vision? A prequel to the resurrection? Or something that cracked the fabric of reality itself? By the 4th century, as Christianity was canonized, creeds formalized, and heresies hunted down, clarity became the prime virtue. The mystery of the faith had to be teachable, reproducible, institutionalized. But the Transfiguration resisted that process like a wild animal in a velvet cage. It couldn't be explained without inviting questions about visions, voices, radiant bodies, and overlapping timelines. And the Church had little patience for the mystical fringe. There were early hints of this nervousness. Augustine, who helped define Western theology, barely mentions the Transfiguration. When he does, it's almost in passing, as if acknowledging it out of obligation. He doesn't explore its implications, doesn't ponder its metaphysical shockwaves. And Augustine wasn't alone. While the resurrection became a cornerstone of belief, the Transfiguration was quietly repositioned as a kind of motivational poster proof of divine approval, nothing more. But not everyone got the memo. In the East, theologians like Gregory Palamas saw the event differently. They clung to its radiant strangeness. For them, the light on the mountain wasn't just a special effect, it was the uncreated light of God Himself. The same light Moses glimpsed. The same glory that filled the tabernacle. Palamas argued that humans could, through deep prayer and union with God, begin to see that light themselves, not metaphorically, actually. This idea, known as hesychasm, was radical and deeply controversial. It was mystical, experiential, and deeply unsettling to institutional control. If ordinary monks could see the divine light, what need was there for bishops and creeds? The Western Church eventually rejected hesychasm as unbalanced mysticism. But it raises the question, did the institutional Church suppress the deeper meanings of the Transfiguration precisely because they were uncontrollable? Consider this: the Gospels present the Transfiguration with almost no interpretation. It's just there, luminous and unexplained. Jesus shines. Moses and Elijah appear. A voice speaks. The disciples collapse. And then, they're told to tell no one. It's as if the event itself defies commentary, which makes later efforts to box it in feel oddly evasive, like someone trying to explain away a UFO sighting with a weather balloon. You might recall the Renaissance explosion of religious art. Crucifixions, resurrections, nativity scenes, you see them in frescoes, stained glass, cathedral domes. But the Transfiguration, strangely rare for such a profound moment. Raphael painted one famously unfinished at his death, but even that canvas is split. Transfiguration on top, and exorcism below, as though the divine had to be balanced with the demonic to make sense. What if that painting is more honest than most theology? What if the suppression of the Transfiguration's deeper meanings wasn't accidental but strategic? If you admit that Jesus shimmered with uncreated light, that ancient prophets walked out of time to speak with him, that a voice from the cloud confirmed his status, not just as Messiah but as something more than you're no longer talking about morality or salvation through crucifixion. You're talking about metaphysics, cosmology, multidimensional beings, and the transformation of matter itself. That's dangerous territory for a religion trying to police borders, define orthodoxy, and maintain institutional control. It may also explain why the mystical branches of Christianity, Gnostics, early ascetics, and Eastern contemplatives held the Transfiguration so close. They saw in it not just a historical event, but a map, a template, a luminous mystery meant not for the mind, but for the spirit. But here's the most curious piece. When you trace the evolution of Transfiguration theology, you find an almost audible silence in the West. You find liturgical mentions, symbolic interpretations, abstract homilies. But rarely do you find anyone treating it as what it might have been, an actual eruption of divine reality into time. Something that, if embraced, would redefine everything. The callback is unavoidable. When Paul spoke of bodies raised in glory of heavenly forms brighter than the sun, he was describing something most Christians hadn't seen. But the 3 disciples had. They had seen him transformed, radiant, speaking with those long dead. And then they were told to keep it quiet. Perhaps not just because others wouldn't believe them. Perhaps because even they didn't fully understand what they'd witnessed. And maybe that's the real reason for its suppression. Because once you let the light in, once you admit that this moment happened in all its radiant, mystical strangeness, you can't unsee it. You can't contain it. And suddenly, the whole narrative opens up like a scroll, shimmering, dangerous, alive. Imagine it not as a miracle, but a rupture, a shimmering fracture in the fabric of the world, not an illusion, not a symbol, a literal moment when linear time was pierced and something older, stranger, more eternal leaked through. That is what some believe the Transfiguration truly was, not a glimpse of what Jesus might become, but a glimpse of what had always been carefully veiled until that instant. The implications are staggering. If this event wasn't just for the disciples, but for us, then what they saw wasn't simply Jesus becoming divine. It was divinity itself slipping into view, framed by the laws of nature cracking at the edges. The light that radiated from his skin didn't shine on him, it emanated from him. It wasn't borrowed or reflected. It was inherent. Recall how Moses' face shone after merely being in God's presence, and yet here Jesus is the source, not the recipient. He does not reflect the glory. He is the glory. And suddenly, all those obscure references throughout Scripture about light, about glory, about the image of the invisible God come into focus. This wasn't performance. It was revelation. Now return to the setting. A high mountain isolated above the noise and dust of the everyday. In ancient cosmology, mountains weren't just geological features. They were liminal spaces, places where heaven kissed earth, where prophets heard voices and fires burned without consuming. And on this mountain, 3 witnesses stood at the thin place. One step further, and they might have slipped out of time entirely. The presence of Moses and Elijah now feels less symbolic and more systemic. Two men who had themselves encountered God in terrifying brilliance, Moses in fire, Elijah in whisper return now, as if summoned by resonance, pulled across dimensions, not by memory, but by recognition. They saw in Jesus not a successor, but a source. The law and the prophets bending back toward their origin point. Even the cloud plays a role. Not a gentle mist, but the same thick cloud of Sinai. The same blinding fog that settled over the tabernacle when God's glory arrived. Out of that cloud, a voice booms, "This is my beloved Son. Listen to him." Not just affirmation, command, authority transferred. The message is clear. The theophanies of the past were previews. This is the main event. And yet, it ends. The light dims. The vision dissolves. They descend the mountain. Why? Because the moment wasn't meant to replace the journey. It was meant to interrupt it, to remind them that beneath the layers of flesh and dust and prophecy was something far older and more radiant than they could bear, and yet something that would soon walk willingly into death. That's the paradox. This revelation of divine glory wasn't a climactic victory, it was a prelude to suffering. A flash of immortality before the bruises. A preview of the resurrection before the betrayal. Jesus doesn't shine after his death. He shines before it, as if to say, "I am not becoming divine. I am returning to what you have always refused to see." It reframes the crucifixion. What if the horror of the cross wasn't just physical pain, but the unbearable irony that this light, this being, was allowed to be nailed to wood and left to die, that the one who shimmered with uncreated light had his blood spill into the dirt, and it reframes resurrection too. Not as a restoration of life, but a continuation of this moment. The veil lifted once more, not just on him, but on what's possible. Paul called it the first fruits, the prototype. The Transfiguration wasn't just about Jesus, it was about humanity's destination, what we are meant to become. And perhaps that's why the story was silenced, simplified, pushed to the edges of theology. Because it doesn't just reveal Jesus, it reveals us. It demands the terrifying possibility that there is more to us, more light, more glory, more mystery, than we've been led to believe. That we too are capable of radiance. That the mountain wasn't the exception, it was the invitation. So what happened that day wasn't just history. It was breach, revelation. Heaven breaking into earth not for spectacle but as a signal. A brief, blinding reminder that beneath robes and sandals and tired feet walked something uncontainable. The radiant, terrifying truth of God, wrapped in flesh. And so the mountain faded behind them. The wind returned, the clouds broke apart, the earth resumed its quiet humming. The three men walked back down the slope, dazed, half-blind from the brilliance they'd just witnessed. No more voices, no more glowing garments. Just the crunch of sandals on rock and the weight of a secret pressing against their ribs. Peter didn't speak. James looked down. John kept glancing back as if the moment might return if only he turned quickly enough. But it didn't. It stayed behind them, suspended in that high place like a silent flare above history. They had seen something unrepeatable. Something too bright for memory, too wild for doctrine, too holy to explain. Not just an event, a presence, a truth too real to hold. And maybe that's the point. That the Transfiguration wasn't meant to be understood. It was meant to be born, carried in the silence, held in the trembling hush between questions. A light kept behind the eyes, glowing faintly in the dark corridors of life, reappearing when least expected. You wonder if they ever spoke of it again. Not just after the resurrection, but years later when old age and persecution made them question what they had followed. Did they still see the glow? Did it blur in their dreams? Did the voice from the cloud still echo in the cracks of their prayers? Or maybe it wasn't about remembering at all. Maybe the transfiguration wasn't for them or for us to recall in detail, but to respond to with a slow, wordless awe. To sense that there are moments when the curtain between this world and the next lifts, and what shines through is not explanation, but glory. You breathe in now, deeper, slower, letting the questions quiet, letting the image fade gently behind your eyes. The mountain has been left behind. The light has been folded back into mystery. But the warmth remains, soft and slow like candlelight behind thin cloth. A glow behind your ribs, a whisper that you are more than dust. And maybe, just maybe, that veil is thinner than we think.